goes your manic pixie dream boy.
Stop. Justin Cole's not my anything.
It's not too late. It's not too late.
You are intolerable.
Did she do it?
Same old conversation, all the small talk that I hate. And I never thought I'd say it, but I'm sick of everyone. I need to sweat it out.
I could switch concentrations. Performance?
Girl, we both know you're a much stronger composer than clarinetist. And there's no money in classical.
Well, jazz.
Never mind. Forget I asked.
Maybe Garrett will help.
Where the fuck is Garrett? Guys?
Graham? Brought your refill.
One's my max. Night before a game.
So strict.
Are you also you, Ali? I can't just find a husband day one of college. I can't talk to a guy like it's no big deal. I walked in on Garrett Graham in the shower and I fell over a laundry cart.
You did what?
I don't want to talk.
So the Bruins are watching every game, how I play, how I behave. I can't lose focus. So, like I said before, all I can offer is casual.
Well, I don't want that anymore.
No, I take it back!
But no one is expecting you to be him.
He is.
All our parents have expectations, G. Shit,
Some films do not begin with danger, they begin with distance. A hallway that feels too quiet, a room that should feel like freedom but somehow feels like a test. A place where everyone is supposed to be finding themselves, but nobody is really telling the truth about who they are. That is the kind of energy Off Campus walks into. It does not feel like a film that wants to grab you by shouting. It feels like a film that wants to lean closer, lower its voice, and make you realize that the most dangerous things in a young person's life are not always the loudest ones. Welcome back to the Film Box. And today we are opening Off Campus, a film that looks from the outside like it belongs to a familiar world. Youth, pressure, relationships, ambition, secrets, bad decisions, and that strange season of life where independence finally arrives. But emotional maturity is still trying to catch up. But the more you sit with it, the more it becomes clear that this is not just a story about leaving home, entering a new environment, or making choices away from the eyes of family. This is a film about what happens when freedom arrives before you are ready to understand the cost of it. That is why Off Campus is interesting, because the title itself already gives you a feeling off campus, away from structure, away from rules, away from the visible system that tells you where to go, when to show up, what to submit, how to behave. On campus, life has a map. Off campus, life becomes something else. It becomes private, messy, unsupervised, more real, and sometimes more revealing. This is the kind of film where the setting is not just a background. It is pleasure, it is temptation, it is escape, it is isolation wearing the mask of freedom. And that is exactly the kind of story we like opening here, because every film is a box. We open it together. Now, before we go deeper, let's make something clear. This is not going to be just a simple plot recap. That would be too easy. And honestly, it would miss the entire reason a film like this exists. Off Campus is the kind of movie that needs to be pulled apart gently. You have to look at the choices, the atmosphere, the silences, the way people avoid saying what they actually mean. You have to look at what the film shows you directly and also what it keeps just outside the frame. Because some stories tell you exactly what they are about. This one asks you to notice. It asks you to notice how a person changes when nobody is watching. It asks you to notice how quickly a safe space can become unstable when trust starts breaking down. It asks you to notice the difference between confidence and performance, between friendship and dependency, between desire and control, between being free and being lost. That is where the emotional engine of Off Campus really lives. And I think that is why this film can hit differently depending on where you are in your own life. If you have ever moved away from home, or stepped into a new chapter, or entered a space where you felt like you had to reinvent yourself overnight, there is something familiar here. That feeling of walking into a room and realizing everyone is performing some version of adulthood. Everyone wants to seem independent. Everyone wants to seem experienced. Everyone wants to seem like they already know how the world works. But underneath that surface, people are scared. They are carrying old wounds into new places. They are making emotional decisions before they fully understand the consequences. They are confusing intensity with connection. They are mistaking attention for love. And sometimes they are choosing chaos simply because calm feels too unfamiliar. That is what makes Off Campus worth talking about. Not because it is flawless, not because every choice lands perfectly, but because it taps into a very specific kind of tension, the tension of being old enough to make dangerous choices, but still young enough to believe you can outrun the damage. And that is a powerful place for a movie to begin. The interesting thing is, films like this can easily become shallow if they only focus on drama. You know the type: pretty people, pretty lighting, big emotions, secrets everywhere. But when a film understands the emotional reason behind the drama, that is when it starts becoming something more layered. That is when the story stops being about what happened and starts being about why it happened. Why does someone stay when they should leave? Why does someone trust the wrong person? Why does someone hide the truth even when the truth would free them? Why do people walk into a new life and still repeat the patterns they were trying to escape? Those are the questions sitting inside this box, and today we are going to open it layer by layer. We are going to talk about the hook, the atmosphere, the story, the filmmaking choices, what works, what falls short, the deeper meaning, the comparisons, the cultural place of this film, and finally, the spoiler breakdown where everything comes together. But for now, I want you to stay in this first feeling. Imagine that moment when someone steps away from the world they know and enters a space where every decision suddenly feels bigger. A message left unread, a door left open, a glance that lasts too long, A friendship that begins with comfort but slowly becomes complicated. A room that should feel like a beginning but slowly starts to feel like a warning. That is the mood Off Campus is playing with. It understands that growing up does not always look like progress. Sometimes it looks like confusion. Sometimes it looks like making the same mistake again, only in a different place. Sometimes it looks like realizing that distance from home does not automatically mean distance from your past. And this is why the film deserves a full breakdown. Because beneath the surface, Off Campus is not only asking what happens when young people are left alone with desire, ambition, fear, and secrecy. It is asking something sharper. When the world finally gives you freedom, what kind of person do you become? That question is the real door into the film. So let's open it. The most gripping thing about Off Campus is not that something goes wrong. It is that the film makes you feel almost immediately that something has already been wrong for a long time. That is a different kind of hook. A louder movie might begin with a shocking incident, a dramatic confrontation, or a mystery thrown directly into your face. Off Campus does something more uncomfortable. It lets you sit inside normal life until normal life starts feeling suspicious. The ordinary spaces begin to feel charged. The casual conversations feel slightly unfinished. The smiles do not always reach the eyes. The silence after someone leaves the room feels heavier than the words they just said. And that is where the film starts pulling you in, because you are not just watching characters enter a new environment. You are watching them enter a version of themselves they may not be ready to face. Here is what makes that powerful. Campus life in most films is sold as energy, new friends, new identity, new chances, late nights, private rooms, first freedoms, that first taste of being away from the people who used to define you. But Off Campus takes that familiar fantasy and turns it sideways. It asks what happens when the space that was supposed to liberate you becomes the place where your worst instincts finally have room to breathe. That is the hook. Freedom does not save anyone here. It exposes them. And once you understand that, every small moment starts to feel different. A locked door is not just a locked door. A late reply is not just a late reply. A new friendship is not just a new friendship. A secret is not just private information. It becomes emotional currency. It becomes power. It becomes something one person can hold over another, even without saying it out loud. That is why the film feels tense even before it fully reveals its hand. It understands that suspense is not always created by danger in the street. Sometimes suspense is created by sitting in the same room with someone and realizing they know exactly where you are vulnerable. Look close at the story, and you can feel the pleasure building underneath the surface. These characters are young, but the film does not treat youth like innocents. It treats youth like a battlefield. Not in a dramatic, exaggerated way, but in a painfully recognizable way. Everyone is trying to become someone. Everyone is testing boundaries. Everyone is pretending to be more certain than they are. And the more they perform confidence, the more you sense the fear underneath it. That fear is the real engine. Fear of being rejected, fear of being exposed, fear of being ordinary, fear of falling behind, fear of not being loved correctly. Fear of making one mistake so large that it follows you into every room afterward. Off Campus understands that people do not always make bad choices because they are careless. Sometimes they make bad choices because they are lonely. Sometimes because they are desperate to be seen. Sometimes because they have mistaken attention for safety. And sometimes because they are standing at the edge of adulthood with no idea how to carry the weight of their own freedom. That makes the film sharper than a simple youth drama. Because the question is not just what will happen. The question is, who will these people become once nobody is protecting them from themselves? And that question is hard to ignore. What gives the film its grip is the way it creates suspicion without needing to announce itself as a thriller. You feel the instability in the relationships before you understand the full shape of the problem. You feel that certain people are hiding more than they admit. You feel that certain choices are being made for reasons the characters themselves may not fully understand. You feel that this off-campus world is not just outside the school system. It is outside the emotional rules these characters used to live by. That is dangerous. Because once people step outside those rules, they do not always become more honest. Sometimes they become better performers. And this is the detail that makes Off Campus interesting. The film is not only interested in what people do, it is interested in the versions of themselves they invent to survive. Someone wants to look strong. Someone wants to look desirable. Someone wants to look in control. Someone wants to look unbothered. Someone wants to look like they are not breaking. But the camera, the pacing, and the emotional tension keep suggesting that the truth is leaking through the performance, not all at once, not loudly, just enough to make you lean in. That is why it becomes hard to scroll past. The film puts you in a place where every relationship feels like it could become a confession or a trap. Every scene carries the possibility that the balance could shift. One wrong sentence, one wrong glance, one badly timed choice, and suddenly the entire emotional structure collapses. And the clever thing is, the film does not need to make every character obviously suspicious. It lets them feel human first, messy first, recognizable first. That makes the tension more uncomfortable because you are not watching monsters move through a story. You are watching people with needs, flaws, pride, insecurity, and pain. People who want to be understood but keep choosing the exact behavior that makes understanding impossible. That is a very human kind of tragedy. Here is where it gets layered. Off campus is not only hooking you with mystery, it is hooking you with recognition. You may not have lived its exact story, but you understand the feeling of being in a space where everyone is acting like they know what they are doing. You understand the pressure of a new chapter. You understand the need to impress. You understand how quickly trust can form when someone says the right thing at the right time. And you understand how frightening it is when the person who made you feel safe starts becoming the reason you feel trapped. That is the emotional hook. The film is asking you to watch the gap between freedom and wisdom. Because freedom arrives fast, wisdom arrives slowly. And in that gap, people can hurt themselves. They can hurt each other. They can confuse desire for destiny. They can mistake secrecy for intimacy. They can build an entire identity on choices they have not fully thought through. That is why Off Campus has a pull to it. It is not only about what happens away from campus. It is about what happens away from supervision, away from family expectations, away from familiar routines, away from the version of yourself everyone back home still believes you are. When nobody is watching, do you become honest or do you become reckless? That is the question sitting underneath the film's first real layer. And once that question enters the room, the story has you. Because now you are no longer watching to see what happens next. You are watching to see which character understands the danger first, and which one understands it too late. Before we even step fully into the story, we have to look at the machine that built it. Because Off Campus is one of those adaptations where the behind the scenes context changes the way you read almost every emotional choice on screen. The first important thing is that Off Campus did not arrive as a completely unknown idea. It came from L.A. Kennedy's best-selling Off-Campus book world, with the first season adapting the deal. The story centered on Hannah Wells and Garrett Graham. That matters because this was never just a random college romance being invented for streaming. It arrived with a built-in emotional map, a fan base that already knew the beats, and a huge amount of expectation around what had to feel familiar and what had to feel new. The series premiered globally on Prime Video on May 30 in 2036 across 8 episodes, which also tells you something about the way the story was designed, not as a quick 2-hour romance, but as a longer emotional build where chemistry, friendship, secrets, and healing all need room to breathe. And that changes how you watch the opening stretch. Because when Hannah and Garrett first begin circling each other, the show is not only introducing two characters, it is negotiating with memory. Book fans are watching for beloved moments. New viewers are watching for emotional clarity. The adaptation has to serve both at once. That is a difficult balance because if you follow the source too mechanically, the story becomes predictable. But if you change too much, you risk breaking the emotional contract with the people who made the story popular in the first place. So when off-campus takes its time with glances, awkward pauses, small acts of trust, and the gradual softening between Hannah and Garrett, it is doing more than stretching romance. It is translating a reading experience into a viewing experience. In a book, internal thoughts can carry the emotional weight. On screen, that same weight has to live in posture, timing, silence, music, framing, and chemistry. That is why so many scenes feel like they are asking you to read between the lines. The show knows it cannot simply tell you what Hannah is feeling. It has to let you see the defense mechanism before you see the wound underneath it. The second production detail that matters is the creative leadership. Off Campus was adapted for television by Louisa Levy, with Jennifer Today also connected as co-showrunner in industry reporting, and the production involved Amazon MGM Studios, Temple Hill Entertainment, and Billings Productions. That combination is important because it places the show inside a very specific streaming ecosystem: polished young adult and new adult drama, emotionally accessible romance, ensemble-friendly storytelling, and a long game franchise mindset. You can feel that in the structure. This is not built like a story that wants to burn through everything in one season and disappear. It is built like a world that wants to keep opening doors. Garrett and Hannah may be the emotional center at first, but the camera is always aware that other characters are waiting at the edge of the frame. Logan is not just comic relief or a best friend. Thakkar is not just another teammate. Dean and Ali are not just background energy. The show plants them like future chapters, and that gives the whole thing a slightly different rhythm. Look closer at the ensemble scenes. The hockey house, the campus spaces, the parties, the practice environment, the friend group conversations. These scenes are not only there for atmosphere, they are franchise architecture. The show is quietly teaching you who matters, where the emotional corridors are, and which connections may become important later. That is why even moments that seem casual often feel loaded. A joke can become foreshadowing, a side glance can become a future storyline. A character who enters like a supporting piece can leave the scene feeling like a promise. That is smart adaptation work, because Off Campus is not adapting only one romance. It is adapting a social ecosystem. The third detail is casting, and this one is huge. Ella Bright and Belmont Cameli were cast as Hannah Wells and Garrett Graham, with Mika Abdallah, Antonio Cipriano, Jelen Thomas Brooks, Stephen Cullen, and Josh Hyston also part of the main ensemble. The reason that matters is simple. The story only works if the chemistry feels believable before the romance becomes obvious. Hannah and Garrett are written as opposites in a very recognizable way. She is guarded, musically driven, emotionally careful. He has the confidence, status, and social gravity of a star athlete. On paper, that can become cliché very quickly. The popular hockey player and the more private music student could easily feel like a familiar trope, being replayed without discovery. But the casting has to sell the thing underneath the trope. Two people who do not just attract each other, but slowly create a space where the other person can stop performing. That is why the casting changes how you watch their scenes together. Garrett cannot simply be charming. If he is only charming, the story becomes shallow. He has to be charming enough that you understand why people are with him, but emotionally observant enough that Hannah's trust in him does not feel foolish. Hannah cannot simply be shy or wounded. If she is only fragile, the story loses its strength. She has to carry intelligence, humor, resistance, and a private sense of self. The romance works only when you believe both characters have power, even if they express it in completely different ways. And when you look at the supporting cast, the same logic applies. The ensemble has to feel like a friend group that already existed before the camera arrived. That is hard. Many shows say characters are close, but you never feel the history. Off campus depends on that lived in energy. The hockey team has to feel like a unit. The friendships have to feel messy and affectionate. The romantic tension has to exist inside a world that feels socially alive. That is why casting is not just a behind the scenes fact here, it is the emotional foundation. The fourth detail is the location and production environment. Reporting around the production places filming in Vancouver, with the first season shooting during 2025. Vancouver has become one of those production cities that can transform itself into many different versions of North American life. And that flexibility matters for off-campus because Blair University has to feel specific emotionally, even if it is fictional. The world has to fit plain enough to hold romance, but lived in enough to hold damage. That is a tricky visual balance. If the campus world looks too glossy, the emotional pain feels decorative. If it looks too grim, the romance loses its warmth. Off-campus needs both. It needs the bright social spaces where people perform confidence, and the quieter corners where that confidence falls apart. It needs the ice rink to feel like pressure and identity. It needs bedrooms and off-campus rooms to feel intimate, but not always safe. It needs hallways that feel transitional, because everyone in this story is emotionally in between. That is where location becomes storytelling. A college setting is naturally full of thresholds. Doors, dorms, classrooms, locker rooms, bars, practice spaces, shared houses, party rooms, empty streets after midnight. Characters are constantly entering and leaving places, and the show uses that movement to mirror the emotional state of young adulthood. Nobody is fully settled. Everyone is passing through, even when someone says they are fine. The geography tells you they are still searching for where they belong. So when you see characters off campus, away from the official spaces of school life, the title becomes more than a label. It becomes a condition. They are away from the rules, away from the predictable routines, away from the version of themselves that can be graded, scheduled, or supervised. Vancouver's controlled production spaces help create that slightly heightened world where college feels both real and cinematic. It is not documentary realism, it is emotional realism. The fifth detail is the early renewal. Prime Video renewed off campus for a second season before the first season even premiered, and later reporting confirmed that the next season would continue the interconnected romance structure by shifting attention toward Dean and Ellie. That is not just business news. It changes the way you understand the first season's storytelling, because when a show knows it has a future, it can afford to plant seeds with confidence. This matters in off campus because the first season does not treat Hannah and Garrett's story as the only box on the shelf. It treats them as the first box opened in a larger room. You can feel that in the way side characters are introduced with emotional weight, not just narrative function. Dean and Ali are not merely there to decorate the main romance. Logan's inner conflict is not just a temporary obstacle. Tucker's presence is not just support. These characters are being positioned as people with future emotional gravity. That early renewal also helps explain why the finale and later episodes can feel like they are balancing closure with invitation. The show wants to satisfy the central romance, but it also wants you to leave with curiosity, not confusion. Curiosity. There is a difference. Confusion means the story failed to answer what mattered. Curiosity means the story answered one emotional question and then revealed that the world is bigger than you thought. That is why off campus feels like it is constantly opening side doors. And here's what most people miss about that. In romance storytelling, the future is part of the pleasure. You are not only watching two people fall for each other, you are watching a community form around them. You are watching patterns repeat, evolve, and break. You are watching different versions of intimacy play out across different personalities. One couple teaches you one emotional lesson, the next couple teaches you another. So when off campus gives attention to the ensemble, it is not drifting away from the main story. It is building the emotional promise of the whole series. Now put these 5 facts together. A best-selling source, a streaming adaptation with franchise design, a cast built around chemistry and ensemble energy, a Vancouver production world shaped into a fictional college environment, an early second season renewal that gives the story confidence beyond its first romance. Suddenly, the show becomes easier to read. You understand why it takes its time. You understand why certain side characters are framed with more importance than a casual viewer might expect. You understand why the hockey scenes are not only about sport, but status, pressure, masculinity, teamwork, and identity. You understand why music matters to Hannah beyond talent. It becomes the language of a person who sometimes cannot say directly what she feels. You understand why Garrett's confidence has to be peeled back slowly, because the show is not interested in destroying the fantasy of the charming athlete. It is interested in asking what happens when that fantasy becomes human. That is the real behind the lens story. Off Campus was built as romance, yes, but it was also built as a world of emotional handoffs. One character opens a door for another. One relationship reveals a theme that another relationship will complicate later. One season gives you a love story, but the larger structure gives you a map of growing up. And when you watch it with that in mind, the surface changes. The parties stop being just parties. The rink stops being just a rink. The fake dating setup stops being just a trope. The off campus spaces stop being just places where the blood can happen. They become emotional laboratories where young people test who they are, who they want, what they fear, and what they are willing to risk in order to feel chosen. That is what the production context reveals. This story was not built only to make you ask, will they end up together? It was built to make you ask why these people need love so badly in the first place, and what kind of healing has to happen before love can become safe. So now that the first pressure is in the room, let's open the box properly. Off Campus, released in 2026, is a Prime Video romantic drama series built from L.A. Kennedy's off-campus book world, with its first season centered on the deal. The story of Hannah and Garrett Graham. The core cast brings Ella Bright in as Hannah, Belmont Cameli as Garrett, with Mika Abdallah, Antonio Cipriano, Jalen Thomas Brooks, Stephen Kaline, Josh Hyacinth, and others filling out the Briar University circle around them. Prime Video lists the season as drama and romance, with directors including Silvertree, Samantha Bailey, Don Wilkinson, and Erica Dunton. And that detail matters because Off Campus is not really trying to hide what kind of story it is. At the surface, this is a college romance, a music student, a hockey star, a deal between two people who think they are using each other for practical reasons, only to discover that emotional honesty has a way of ruining every clean arrangement. That is the shape you can see from far away, but the closer you get, the more the story becomes about trust, recovery, performance, masculinity, female desire, ambition, and the difficult process of letting someone see the part of you that you usually keep protected. Spoiler-free verdict. First, Off Campus works best when it stops trying to simply be a romance and starts becoming a story about emotional safety. That is where the show has its strongest pulse. Because yes, the setup has familiar ingredients. The confident athlete, the guarded girl, the fake arrangement, the social pressure, the private pain. The slow shift from irritation to curiosity, then from curiosity to dependence, then from dependence to something neither person can fully control. You have seen pieces of that before. The show knows you have seen pieces of that before. The question is not whether the ingredients are new. The question is whether the recipe has feeling. And when Off Campus leans into feeling, it finds something. At its heart, this is not a story about two attractive people being pulled together by convenience. It is a story about two people who are both performing strength in different languages. Garrett performs it through confidence, charm, athletic dominance, and social ease. Hannah performs it through control, independence, discipline, and emotional distance. One looks open but hides pain under charisma. The other looks close but carries an inner fire that refuses to be reduced to damage. That contrast is the engine. What makes the dynamic interesting is that neither person is simply the rescuer. That would make the story cheaper. Garrett does not exist only to heal Hannah. Hannah does not exist only to humble Garrett. The better reading is that each one forces the other to stop relying on the mask that used to work. Garrett cannot charm his way through real intimacy. Hannah cannot protect herself forever by pretending that wanting something makes her weak. That is the box the show opens. It asks, what happens when the person who annoys you most becomes the person who sees you most clearly? And this is why the university setting matters so much. Briar is not just a romantic backdrop. It is a pressure cooker. It gives every character a stage. Athletes are watched. Musicians are judged. Friendships become social currency. Relationships become public information before they become private truth. Everyone is trying to decide who they are, but they are doing it while surrounded by people who are also pretending to know themselves. That is a dangerous environment for vulnerability because in college stories, people often talk about freedom like it is automatically positive, but off campus understands that freedom can be confusing. Freedom can be lonely. Freedom can put the wrong people in the right room at the wrong time. Freedom can make you believe you are finally in control when really you are just making decisions without a safety net. That is why the title keeps working. Off campus does not only mean away from the university buildings, it means away from the official version of life, away from the syllabus, away from the coach's whistle, away from parents, teachers, schedules, and the people who used to define the boundaries. Off campus is where the real self comes out, but not always in a clean or flattering way. It is where desire gets messy, where friendship becomes complicated, where secrets stop being abstract and start shaping behavior. So, who is this for? If you like romance that moves through emotional wounds instead of pretending nobody has them, this is for you. If you like stories where attraction is not just physical, but psychological, where two people have to earn softness from each other, this is for you. If you enjoy college set dramas with friend groups, sports culture, music, romantic tension, and that slightly heightened feeling of young adulthood, this world is easy to enter. But if you need every story beat to feel completely original, or if familiar romance tropes make you impatient, off campus may test you. It is not hiding from its genre. It is very much standing inside it. The fake dating energy, the opposites attract pull, the popular athlete structure, the guarded heroine, the emotionally loaded past, these are not accidents. They are part of the design. The question is whether the show can make those tropes feel alive. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it gets close but does not fully push as deep as it could. And that is going to become important later when we talk about what works and where it falls short. Because a story like this depends on balance. Too much fantasy and the pain feels decorative. Too much pain and the romance loses its warmth. Too much comedy and the emotional stakes soften. Too much seriousness and the college world stops feeling fun. The show is constantly walking that line. The reason someone should care before spoilers begin is simple. Off campus is about the moment in life when love feels exciting because it arrives at the exact place where you are most unprepared for it. That is powerful because the first serious connection of adulthood can feel like a mirror you did not ask for. Suddenly, someone notices your habits, your avoidance, your fear, your pride, the way you joke when things get too real, the way you shut down when someone gets too close. The way you pretend the past is finished when it is still sitting quietly beside you. Off campus uses romance to talk about that mirror. It understands that attraction can be fun, but being known is frightening. It understands that chemistry may pull two people together, but trust is the thing that decides whether they can stay there. And it understands that healing does not look like one perfect conversation, it looks like hesitation, missteps, small choices, a person deciding again and again not to run. That is the real promise of the story. Not just will Hannah and Garrett fall for each other, but can they become honest enough to survive being loved? That is why this box is worth opening. The first feeling off campus gives you is not shock, it is recognition. That is what surprised me most. I walked in expecting a clean college romance with sharp chemistry, some dramatic misunderstandings, a little sports world confidence, a little music world vulnerability, and the familiar pleasure of watching two people who should not work together slowly realize they do. And yes, the film gives you that surface. It understands the appeal. It knows exactly why this kind of story pulls people in. But underneath that, it gives you something more restless. It gives you the feeling of being young enough to believe every choice is temporary, but old enough for those choices to leave permanent marks. That is what hit me in the opening stretch. The world of off campus does not feel innocent. Even when the spaces are bright, social, active, and full of movement, there is this emotional pressure underneath everything. It feels like everyone is trying to prove something, not always to each other, sometimes to themselves. Hannah wants control over her own story. Garrett wants control over the image everyone already has of him. The people around them want to appear confident, desirable, successful, unbothered. And the more everyone performs certainty, the more the uncertainty becomes visible. That is a strong first impression, because the film does not open like a fantasy where college is just freedom, parties, romance, and possibility. It opens like a place where freedom has consequences. You feel that in the way the environment is presented. The campus world has energy, but it is not weightless. There is movement everywhere, but not peace. Students pass through spaces like they are rushing toward identities they have not earned yet. The ring carries pressure. The classrooms carry expectation. The music spaces carry exposure. The off campus rooms carry a temptation, secrecy, and the strange intimacy of being somewhere private with someone you barely know but somehow already feel connected to. That atmosphere matters because the best college tourists understand that this stage of life is not just about becoming independent, it is about becoming visible in a new way. Away from home, you can reinvent yourself, but you can also exaggerate yourself. You can become braver, but you can also become reckless. You can finally speak honestly, but you can also hide behind a new personality and hope nobody notices the difference. Off campus taps into that feeling very quickly. The opening scenes have this soft tension, like the story is not rushing, but it is already watching. It lets you feel the social structure before it asks you to care about the romance. You understand that Garrett moves through this world with a kind of natural power. People notice him, people expect things from him. His body belongs to the sport, his reputation belongs to the campus, and his confidence looks effortless from the outside, but the film is careful not to make that confidence feel empty. Even early on, you get the sense that charm is not the whole person, it is a shield that happens to look like a gift. Then Hannah enters the emotional frame differently. She does not move like someone trying to own every room. She moves like someone trying to control how much of herself the room gets to see, and that immediately makes her interesting. She is not written as fragile in a simple way. She is guarded, but not weak, careful, but not cold. There is something inside her that is clearly still carrying weight, but she does not want that weight to become the only thing people understand about her. That is where the first 10 minutes start working, because the film hooks you not by forcing chemistry too quickly, but by making you curious about the walls these two characters have built. Gary's wall is public approval, Hannah's wall is private control. And when those walls begin touching each other even lightly, the story gets a pulse. The atmosphere is also doing a lot of invisible work. There is a constant contrast between noise and silence. Social scenes feel busy, but the emotional truth often arrives in quieter moments. A look held for half a second too long, a pause before someone answers, a character leaving a conversation with more tension than they entered it. These are small things, but they create the feeling that the real story is happening underneath the spoken one. That is what made it hard to look away, not because everything was exploding at once, because everything felt like it could. The film gives you the pleasure of romantic tension, but it also keeps reminding you that attraction is complicated when people are carrying unresolved pain. That is important. A weaker version of this story would treat chemistry like a cure. It would suggest that if two people want each other badly enough, all the damage around them simply becomes decoration. Off campus is stronger when it resists that. It lets attraction be exciting, but it also lets it be frightening. Because being wanted is not the same as being safe. Being seen is not the same as being understood. And being close to someone does not automatically mean you are ready to be honest with them. That emotional caution gives the first watch a different texture. You are not just waiting for Hannah and Garrett to fall into each other, you are waiting to see whether they can handle what falling actually means. And the film understands the power of delay. It knows that the first spark is not the real reward. The real reward is the slow change in how two people listen to each other. The way irritation becomes attention, the way attention becomes concern, the way concern becomes trust before either person is fully ready to name it. That is the kind of romantic build that works because it lets the emotional temperature rise 1 degree at a time. Picture this moment. Someone who is used to being admired meets someone who does not immediately give them the reaction they expect. That alone creates tension. But then look closer. It is not only romantic tension, it is identity tension. Garrett is used to a world where his status explains him before he speaks. Hannah does not let that status do the work. She makes him become a person in front of her, and Garrett, in return, forces Hannah into situations where her emotional distance is not as invisible as she thinks. That is where the film starts becoming more than a trope, because tropes are not the problem. Empty tropes are the problem. A familiar setup can still feel alive if the characters inside it are specific enough, wounded enough, funny enough, stubborn enough, and human enough to make the path feel uncertain. Off-campus uses a familiar door, but the emotional room behind it has enough tension to keep you inside. My first reaction was that the film knows exactly what fantasy it is selling, but it is most interesting when it quietly questions that fantasy. The fantasy says the star athlete can fall for the guarded girl and make her feel chosen. The deeper story asks whether being chosen matters if you still do not know how to feel safe. The fantasy says a fake arrangement can become real love. The deeper story asks what happens when the fake part gives people permission to admit the real part. The fantasy says opposites attract. The deeper story asks whether they are really opposites, or just two people hiding pain in opposite ways. That is why the opening works. It gives you enough charm to relax, enough tension to lean forward, and enough emotional shadow to understand that this story is not going to stay simple. The world feels inviting, but not harmless. The romance feels exciting, but not weightless. The characters feel young, but not empty. And the title keeps echoing in the background because the more time we spend away from the official spaces, the more we understand that off campus is where the truth starts leaking out. That first watch feeling is the feeling of standing at the edge of a door and knowing two things at once. Something beautiful might happen here, and something could break. What makes off campus visually interesting is that it does not treat romance as only something that happens between faces. It treats romance as something that happens to space. The way people stand near each other, the way they hesitate before crossing a room, the way a doorway can feel like a boundary, the way a shared table can become a negotiation, the way the camera lets distance speak before the characters do. That is the first technical choice that really matters here. The film understands that emotional closeness is not only written in dialogue, it is built through blocking. When Hannah and Garrett are not yet comfortable with each other, the frame often feels like it is measuring the space between them. Not in a loud, obvious way, more like the camera is asking, who has control of this room? Who is performing confidence? Who is protecting themselves? Who wants to move closer but refuses to be the first one to admit it? That kind of visual storytelling is important because this is a story about trust slowly becoming possible, so the physical distance between characters becomes emotional information. Early on, separation matters. Characters sit across from each other, not beside each other. They speak from opposite sides of a space. They enter rooms with different energy. Garrett often carries the confidence of someone used to being watched, while Hannah carries the caution of someone used to deciding exactly how much of herself the world is allowed to see. That contrast is visible before it becomes romantic. The camera work supports that by avoiding a purely glossy romance style. Yes, the world has polish. The campus spaces, the social environments, the athletic settings, and the private interiors all have a clean, streaming drama finish. But the better moments are not the ones that look perfect. They are the moments where the frame allows a little emotional discomfort to remain, a pause that lasts slightly longer than expected. A character held in medium shot when a tighter close up would feel easier. A conversation framed with just enough distance to remind you that intimacy has not fully arrived yet. That restraint matters, because when the camera finally moves closer, you feel the shift. Close ups in off campus work best when they are treated like emotional reveals, not decoration. A face in this story is not just a face, it is a locked room with the lights beginning to come on. Hannah's guardedness needs close ups that do not over explain her. Garrett's charm needs close ups that slowly expose what the charm is hiding. The film becomes more effective when it lets you sit with micro reactions, a swallowed answer, a look away, a half smile that fades too quickly, a moment where someone hears something that lands deeper than they want to admit. This is where the editing rhythm becomes crucial. A romance like this cannot cut too fast all the time because emotional tension needs air. If every scene moves like a highlight reel, the relationship feels manufactured. Off campus is strongest when the editing allows awkwardness to breathe. It lets certain moments hang just long enough for you to feel the unsaid thing inside them. That is especially important in scenes where Hannah and Garrett are pretending the situation is simple. The pacing quietly disagrees with them. The pause after a joke tells you more than the joke. The silence after a practical arrangement tells you the arrangement is already becoming something else. That is smart editing, because the story is built on denial. Two people keep acting like they are making logical choices, but the rhythm of the scenes tells you their emotions are moving ahead of their explanations. The sport sequences have a different function. The hockey world brings motion, speed, pressure, and identity. It gives Garrett a visual language separate from romance. On the ice, movement is direct. Bodies collide with purpose, choices happen fast, reputation is visible, skill is public. That world tells you who Garrett is when everyone is watching him. It shows the version of him that is measured, ranked, admired, and judged. Then the film contrasts that with quieter spaces where he has no scoreboard to hide behind. That contrast is one of the more meaningful technical ideas. The rink is external pressure, the private rooms are internal pressure. On the ice, Garrett can act through instinct. Off the ice, especially with Hannah, he has to listen. He has to slow down. He has to stop using confidence as motion and start using honesty as presence. That is why movement matters. When the camera follows Garrett in athletic spaces, there is a sense of flow and momentum. But when he is with Hannah, the energy changes. The film becomes more still, more watchful, more attentive to hesitation. It is almost like the visual grammar is telling us that romance is the one arena where speed will not help him win. For Hannah, music gives the film another technical language. Music scenes are not only about talent, they are about exposure. A person can hide in conversation and still reveal themselves through art. That is why lighting and sound become so important around her creative spaces. The sound design, when handled well, allows music to feel like emotional access, not background, not decoration. Access, it becomes a way into her inner life without forcing her to explain herself out loud. This is important because Hannah's story depends on agency. The film should never reduce her to what hurt her. It has to show who she is beyond survival. Music helps do that. Framing helps do that. Lighting helps do that. When the camera gives her space to exist as a performer, a thinker, and a person with private ambition, the story becomes fuller. She is not just someone being loved. She is someone becoming more fully herself. Color also plays a quiet role. The world of off-campus often moves between social warmth and emotional coolness. Party spaces, friend group scenes, and moments of campus life can carry a warmer, more inviting texture. But the emotional scenes often pull back into softer, quieter tones. That shift helps the story separate public energy from private truth. In public, everything can look alive. In private, the real questions begin. Lighting follows the same idea. The most effective romantic dramas do not simply light people beautifully. They light the emotional condition of a scene. A bright room can feel lonely if the blocking isolates a character. A darker room can feel safe if the framing finally lets two people share space honestly. Off-campus works best when light is not just attractive but meaningful. When a character steps out of shadow emotionally or literally, the moment should feel earned. When someone remains half lit, it should feel like part of them is still being protected. Production design also supports the central theme. The off-campus spaces feel different from official campus spaces because they carry fewer rules. A classroom tells you how to behave. A ring tells you how to perform. A stage tells you how to be judged. But an apartment, a bedroom, a hallway after a long night, a kitchen conversation when nobody else is around, those spaces are looser. more intimate, more dangerous. They allow people to become honest, but they also allow people to make mistakes without witnesses. That is the visual meaning of the title. Off campus is not just where the characters go, it is where the film removes the safety rails. And that is why framing doors, thresholds, and shared interiors become so useful. The characters are constantly crossing invisible lines, from convenience into attachment, from teasing into vulnerability, from control into risk, from performance into truth. The film's technical choices matter when they make those crossings feel physical. The sound design does something similar. The loud environments create social pressure. Crowds, parties, practice, public spaces, they make the world feel full, but not always intimate. Then, when the sound drops away and two characters are left with only their voices, the emotional stakes rise. Quiet becomes confrontation. A soft answer can feel louder than a crowd because the film has trained you to understand that silence is where these characters stop performing. That is the key to the technique in Off Campus. It is not about showing off. It is about translating emotional risk into camera distance, rhythm, light, sound, and space. When the film remembers that, it becomes more than a romance playing familiar beats. It becomes a story where every technical choice is asking the same question the characters are avoiding. How close can you let someone get before you have to become honest? The story begins with Hannah Wells trying to keep her life under control. That is the first thing to understand about her. She is not someone drifting through college without direction. She has a rhythm. She has classes, music, friends, routines, and a very deliberate way of managing how much of herself other people are allowed to access. She is not closed off because she has nothing inside. She is closed off because there is too much inside, and she has learned that not everyone deserves the full version of her. That is why her world feels careful. Hannah is the kind of character who has already survived something before the story begins. The film does not need to define her only by that pain, but it lets you feel that her caution came from somewhere. She is not simply shy, she is selective. She is not simply guarded, she is protecting the part of herself that still feels unfinished. And because of that, her first real emotional problem is not whether she can fall in love. It is whether she can trust happiness when it starts walking toward her. Then Garrett Graham enters the frame like someone who has never had to ask permission to take up space. He is confident, athletic, popular, and used to attention. In the world of Briar, Garrett is not just another student, he is a visible person. People know his name. People expect him to perform. People watch how he moves. His identity is tied to hockey, reputation, status, and that specific kind of charm that can open doors before he even touches the handle. But here's what most people miss. Garrett is not free either. His confidence looks like freedom, but it is also a role. He has to be the captain, the star, the guy who handles pressure, the guy who can laugh things off, the guy who never seems shaken. That kind of performance can look powerful from the outside. But the more the story moves, the more you realize that being admired is not the same as being known. So the film puts Hannah and Garrett in the same orbit for a reason. Not because they are obvious soulmates from the first second, because they are both hiding behind different versions of control. Hannah wants emotional control. Garrett wants social control. She protects herself through distance. He protects himself through charm. She avoids being read too easily. He makes sure people read the version of him he wants them to see. And then the deal begins. At first, it looks simple. Garrett needs help. Hannah has something he needs academically, and Garrett, being Garrett, believes he can push, persuade, negotiate, and charm his way into getting what he wants. But Hannah is not impressed in the way he expects. That is crucial. She does not immediately orbit him. She does not treat his popularity like a magic key. She sees the performance, and instead of melting into it, she pushes back. That is the first crack in Garrett's usual world. For him, Hannah becomes interesting because she does not respond according to the script he is used to. For her, Garrett becomes irritating because he refuses to disappear when she dismisses him. Their early exchanges carry that classic friction, but the film is smarter when it lets the friction reveal character. Garrett's persistence is not only arrogance, it is also desperation covered in charm. Hannah's resistance is not only stubbornness, it is also self respect sharpened by experience. The arrangement starts with practical motives. Garrett wants Hannah's help. Hannah has her own reasons for agreeing, especially because Garrett's social position can help her become visible to someone else. So they step into this strange performance where both of them think they understand the rules. Help me with this. Pretend that. Push this person's attention in that direction. Keep it clean. Keep it temporary. Keep it controlled. But the problem with pretending is that pretending still creates real moments. That is where the story starts breathing. At first, their connection is almost transactional. They are using each other, or at least telling themselves they are. But little by little, the performance starts becoming a space where honesty slips through. A study session becomes a conversation. A sarcastic exchange becomes a moment of real listening. Our staged closeness begins to reveal actual comfort, and suddenly the deal that was supposed to keep things simple starts making everything more complicated. This is the moment the film understands its own engine, because the best version of this story is not about two people suddenly realizing they are attracted to each other. Attraction is easy. The real story is about two people discovering that the other person makes them feel less alone in a way they did not plan for. For Hannah, Garrett becomes dangerous because he is not only charming, he is attentive. He notices when her energy changes. He pushes, but he also listens when it matters. He can be arrogant, yes, but he is not emotionally empty. That distinction is important. If Garrett were only the confident hockey star, the romance would feel flat. But when the film lets him become curious about Hannah's interior life, the dynamic deepens. For Garrett, Hannah becomes dangerous because she does not worship the image. She sees through parts of him. She challenges him. She does not let him coast on reputation. She makes him feel like he has to become more honest if he wants to stay near her. And for someone who is used to winning through performance, that kind of intimacy is terrifying. So the story keeps tightening. Their fake connection begins affecting the real social world around them. People notice. Friends react. The university environment starts doing what it always does, turning private choices into public signals. That is part of the pressure of off campus. Nothing stays fully private for long. A glance becomes gossip, a rumor becomes expectation, a performance starts demanding emotional consequences. And the deeper Hannah and Garrett move into this arrangement, the more both of them have to face what they are actually seeking. Hannah thinks she wants control over how she is perceived. She thinks she can use the situation to guide attention elsewhere, to shape a new possibility, to test the waters without exposing too much of herself. But the more time she spends with Garrett, the more that plan starts to feel like a defense mechanism. Because what she says she wants and what makes her feel seen are not necessarily the same thing. That is very human. Sometimes we chase the person who fits the idea we have built in our head while quietly becoming vulnerable with someone we never planned to need. Garrett, meanwhile, begins with a practical goal. He needs academic help. He needs to protect his position, his future, his place on the team. But what starts as academic survival becomes emotional disruption. Hannah is not part of his plan. She does not fit neatly into his controlled image. She makes him laugh, frustrates him, challenges him, and slowly becomes the person he cannot reduce to a convenient arrangement. The friendship develops almost against their will, and that is why it works. Because they do not instantly become soft. They earn softness. The film lets them stay sharp with each other. It lets them misread each other. It lets them carry pride into scenes where honesty would be easier but much scarier. And each time they choose to stay in the conversation instead of running from it, the bond gets stronger. Then the emotional past begins pressing into the present. Hannah's pain is not treated as a twist designed only to make the romance heavier. It is part of how she moves through the world. It shapes what closeness means to her. It shapes what touch, trust, desire, and safety mean. She is not trying to be difficult. She is trying to live inside her own body and her own choices after something changed the way she relates to both. That is where Garrett's role becomes delicate. The story is strongest when it does not make him a magical solution. He cannot fix Hannah. Love cannot erase trauma. Charm cannot undo fear. What Garrett can do when he is at his best is create moments where Hannah does not feel pressure to perform recovery for someone else. He can listen. He can respect boundaries. He can make space. He can become proof that intimacy does not have to mean losing control. That is a very important distinction because the romance becomes meaningful only when Hannah's agency stays at the center. Her healing has to belong to her. Garrett can matter, but he cannot replace the work of becoming whole. The film understands this most clearly in its quieter scenes where the emotional victory is not a grand declaration but a small moment of trust. A look held without fear, a truth shared without collapse. A choice made because she wants it, not because someone pushes her toward it. At the same time, Garrett has his own hidden pressure. His family background, his relationship with expectation, and the weight behind his public confidence begin to reveal that he is not as untouchable as he first seemed. This is where the story mirrors Hannah and Garrett beautifully. Both have been, both have learned to manage it through control. Hannah controls access, Garrett controls image, and both are exhausted by the masks that help them survive. The fake arrangement becomes a place where those masks start failing. The more they know each other, the harder it becomes to return to pretending. Their banter starts carrying sincerity. Their practical meetings start carrying anticipation. Their public performance starts becoming less different from private truth. And that creates the central romantic tension, not whether they like each other, but when they will stop hiding behind the original excuse that brought them together. The surrounding characters deepen that pressure. Friends notice the shift before Hannah and Garrett are ready to name it. The hockey world keeps pulling Garrett back into pressure and expectation. Hannah's musical ambition keeps reminding us that she is not just part of his story. She has her own voice, her own future, her own battle to be seen for more than the thing she survived. The compass setting keeps turning every emotional move into something with social consequences. That is why Off Campus feels busiest when it is actually talking about vulnerability. The parties, practices, classes, rehearsals, friend group moments, and off campus rooms are all different stages where the same question keeps appearing. Who are you when you stop performing? Hannah and Garrett keep being pushed toward that answer, sometimes gently, sometimes painfully, sometimes through jealousy, sometimes through misunderstanding, sometimes through the uncomfortable realization that wanting someone does not automatically mean you know how to be good for them. That is one of the film's strongest emotional truths. Love is not only chemistry, it is responsibility. And young love often struggles with that because the feeling arises before the tools. Hannah and Garrett feel the pull before they fully know how to communicate. They care before they fully know how to protect each other from their own fears. They want honesty, but honesty threatens the identities they have built. So the story becomes a dance between approach and retreat. They move closer, they step back, they say less than they mean. Then they say too much at the wrong time. They hurt each other not because they are cruel, but because they are still learning how to stop using defense mechanisms as weapons. That is what gives the middle of the story its emotional shape. The arrangement can no longer stay harmless. The lines blur. Feelings become undeniable. Other romantic possibilities begin to feel less like real options and more like distractions from the obvious truth. And yet, because both characters are carrying fear, the obvious truth is the hardest thing to accept. Hannah has to confront the possibility that safety can exist without control. Garrett has to confront the possibility that love cannot be won like a game. And when those two realizations start pressing against each other, the story changes. The romance stops being a clever setup and becomes a test of character. Garrett has to show whether his care is deeper than his desire. Hannah has to decide whether protecting herself still means keeping everyone at a distance. Both of them have to understand that intimacy is not proven in the exciting moments. It is proven in the moments where someone could mishandle your vulnerability and chooses not to. That is the turning point underneath the surface. Not a single dramatic scene, but a slow emotional reorientation. Garrett begins to become less interested in being admired and more interested in being trusted. Hannah begins to become less interested in staying untouched by feeling and more willing to admit that wanting someone does not make her weak. From there, the story starts moving toward consequence, because every deal has a cost. The original arrangement was built on the belief that feelings could be managed like strategy. But feelings do not obey contracts. They do not stay inside the lines drawn for them. Once Hannah and Garrett become real to each other, the old rules stop working. The social performance collapses into emotional truth. The fake reason for being close can no longer hide the real reason they keep choosing each other. And that is where the film's title becomes fully alive. Off campus is where the controlled version of life breaks open, away from the official spaces, away from the public identities, away from the roles they know how to play. Hannah and Garrett have to face the one thing neither of them can fake anymore. They are not just part of each other's plans, they have become part of each other's healing. But healing is not clean. It brings old fear to the surface. It forces painful honesty. It asks whether love can remain gentle when the past enters the room. And by the time the story reaches its emotional center, we understand that the deal was never really the point. The deal was the door. What waited behind it was trust. And trust in this story is more frightening than attraction, more complicated than desire, and more powerful than any public performance either of them try to maintain. That is why the story works when it works. It takes a familiar romantic structure and uses it to ask a deeper question. Can two people who build their lives around control learn to choose each other without turning love into another kind of performance? The answer does not arrive all at once. It arrives through small choices, through patience, through mistakes, through the courage to stay when running would be easier, through the moment when the person you never planned to need becomes the person who makes you feel real. And this is the moment the box opens completely. What Off Campus does brilliantly is that it understands chemistry as behavior, not just attraction. That is the first thing that works. Because in a weaker romance, chemistry is treated like lighting. Put two beautiful people in the same flame, give them a few sharp lines, add music, and hope the audience believes in the connection. But Off Campus is strongest when it makes chemistry come from how Hannah and Garrett respond to each other under pressure. It is in the interruptions, the pushback, the way one person notices when the other is pretending, the way irritation slowly becomes attention, the way attention becomes care before either of them is ready to call it that. That is a real romantic engine. Garrett commands the screen because he enters the story with confidence, but the performance works best when that confidence begins to crack. The most interesting version of Garrett is not the easy charmer who can walk into a room and own it. It is the Garrett who suddenly has to slow down because Hannah does not respond to the usual version of him. She makes him work harder, not to impress her, but to be real with her. And that shift is what gives him depth. A specific kind of scene proves it. Any moment where Garrett could hide behind humor, status, or flirtation, but instead chooses to listen. That is where the character becomes more than the popular athlete fantasy. He becomes someone learning that attention is not the same as intimacy. He can be watched by everyone and still feel unseen. And when Hannah begins to see the person underneath the image, the story starts gaining emotional weight. Hannah works for the opposite reason. She does not command the screen by taking over every room. She commands it by making restraint feel active. That is hard to do. A girl-led character can easily become passive if the writing does not give her interior force. But Hannah has force. She has boundaries. She has wit. She has ambition. She has a private emotional life that does not exist only to serve the romance. And that matters because the story depends on her being a full person before she becomes one half of a couple. Her strongest moments are not only the painful ones. They are the moments where she chooses herself in small, firm ways. When she refuses to be reduced to someone's assumption, when she does not let Garrett's reputation intimidate her, when she allows softness without surrendering control over her own story, that balance is what makes her compelling. She is vulnerable, but she is not helpless. She is wounded, but she is not empty. She is cautious, but she is still capable of desire, humor, anger, and courage. That is one of the film's biggest strengths. It does not confuse healing with becoming lovable. Hannah does not need to become less complicated in order to deserve love. Garrett does not need to become perfect in order to be worth trusting. The romance works because both characters are imperfect in ways that make sense. Their flaws are not random drama machines. They come from the emotional survival tools they have been using for years. Hannah protects herself by limiting access. Garrett protects himself by controlling the image. When those tools stop working, the story becomes interesting. Structurally, the film also uses the deal in a smart way. The fake arrangement is not just a cute plot device, it is a pressure system. It forces Hannah and Garrett into proximity before they are emotionally ready, but it also gives them a safe excuse to become close. That is why the trope works here. The lie creates a space where the truth can grow quietly. They can say this is practical. They can say this is strategic. They can say this is strategic. But the audience can see that the arrangement is becoming emotionally dangerous long before the characters admit it. That is satisfying storytelling because the best romantic structure gives you two timelines at once. The timeline the characters believe they are living, and the timeline the audience can already feel. Hannah and Garrett think they are managing a deal. We know they are building trust. They think they are using proximity as a tool. We know proximity is changing them. They think they are protecting themselves by keeping the rules clear. We know the rules are already collapsing. That dramatic irony gives the story momentum. The direction and visuals work best when they support that slow collapse. The show understands the value of rooms, thresholds, and shared space. It does not always need a massive visual gesture. Sometimes the strongest direction is simple: two characters in a room trying to pretend the emotional temperature has not changed. A camera that waits. A cut that arrives half a second later than expected. A frame that lets one person watch the other before they speak. Those choices make the relationship feel observed, not forced. The hockey word is another strength because it gives the story texture beyond romance. Garrett's life on the ice is not separate from his emotional life. It is a visual version of who he thinks he has to be. Strong, fast, useful, competitive, reliable under pressure. The sport gives him status, but it also traps him inside expectation. That is why the ring scenes matter. They give the story a physical rhythm, and they show us what Garrett looks like when his value is measured publicly. Then the quieter scenes with Hannah become the contrast. With her, he cannot win by speed. He cannot score his way out of vulnerability. He cannot rely on applause. He has to be present. He has to listen. He has to sit with discomfort. And that contrast gives his romantic arc more shape than the usual star athlete storyline. Hannah's music serves a similar function. It gives her identity beyond the romance, and it gives the film a softer emotional language. Music becomes the place where she can express what she cannot always say directly. That is important because Off Campus is built around people who struggle to say the truth in plain language. So the sound, the performance spaces, the rehearsals, and the moments where Hannah's voice becomes central all help remind us that she has an inner world that existed before Garrett and will continue beyond him. That is good character construction. Music and sound also shape the emotion of the film in a subtle way. The best moments are not when the soundtrack tells you exactly what to feel. They are when the sound creates emotional contrast. A noisy party can make someone feel more alone. A quiet room can make a small confession feel enormous. A performance can reveal more than a conversation. A pause can become the loudest thing in the scene. That is where Off Campus finds its rhythm. The one scene that feels completely unforgettable is not necessarily the biggest dramatic turn. It is the kind of scene where the performance drops. A scene where Hannah and Garrett stop treating each other like roles. Not the hockey star, not the guarded girl, not the fake arrangement, not the person who can help with the problem. Just two people standing in the uncomfortable truth that something real has happened between them. That kind of moment is unforgettable because it is not about spectacle, it is about recognition. You can feel the shift when two characters realize that the thing they were pretending to control has started controlling them, and the film knows how to let that realization land. It does not need to rush into dramatic speech. It can let the silence do some of the work. It can let the audience feel the danger of tenderness. That is one of the most beautiful things romance can do when it is handled well. It can make tenderness feel risky. Off campus also works because it treats young adulthood with a certain seriousness. It does not laugh at these characters for feeling too much. It understands that when you are young, every emotion can feel like a first draft of your entire future. A choice feels massive. A rejection feels defining. A secret feels impossible to survive. A connection can feel like rescue, even when it is really just the beginning of harder honesty. The film gives that stage of life weight, and because of that, even its familiar pieces have emotional charge. The fate deal, the campus gossip, the athlete reputation, the private wound, the slow burn connection, the friend group, the parties, the music, the off campus spaces, these are all recognizable ingredients. But the film works when it uses them to explore something true, the terrifying beauty of being seen before you feel ready. That is the strength at the center. Off campus is at its best when it remembers that love is not only the spark, it is the moment after the spark when someone has to decide whether they are brave enough to stay in the light. Where off campus falls short is not in the idea is strong. The emotional engine is clear. The setup has built in tension. The characters have wounds, chemistry, ambition, and conflict. The world has enough texture to support more than one story. But the places where the film struggles are the places where it sometimes trusts the familiar shape of the genre more than the specific emotional truth underneath it. That is the first problem. At times, Off Campus leans too comfortably on the fact that you already understand this kind of romance. The popular athlete, the guarded girl, the arrangement that becomes real, the social performance that slowly turns into emotional confession. Those elements can absolutely work, and sometimes they do. But when the lighting moves through them too quickly, you can feel the machinery. You can sense the story saying you know what this moment means instead of making you feel it freshly. That matters because romance lives and dies on specificity. A familiar trope is not automatically weak, but it needs new texture. It needs one detail, one choice, one emotional angle that makes you say, yes, I know this shape, but I have not felt it exactly like this before. Off campus has moments where it finds that freshness, especially in Hannah's guarded strength and Garrett's slow emotional softening. But it also has moments where the scene lands exactly where you expect, in almost exactly the way you expect. And predictability is not always the enemy. Emotional flatness is. The second issue is pacing. The film has a lot to balance: romance, trauma, hockey pressure, academic stakes, music, friendships, campus life, family history, future ensemble setup, and the deeper healing arc. That is a heavy load. When it works, the world feels rich. When it does not, the story can feel like it is touching too many doors without opening all of them fully. Some scenes need more breathing room. Certain emotional shifts feel like they deserve an extra beat. Not a long speech, not more exposition, not more exposition, just more silence, more reaction, more time watching a character process what has just happened. Because when a story is dealing with trust, recovery, and emotional safety, speed can weaken impact. If a character reveals something painful or makes a major emotional turn, the next moment has to carry the weight of that reveal. Otherwise, the story risks making serious material feel like another step in the romance formula. That is a delicate problem, and off campus does not always miss it. But when it does, you notice. The third weakness is that some supporting characters feel more like future promises than fully present people. You can understand why. This is an interconnected world, and the story wants to prepare you for other arcs. It wants you to feel that Briar is bigger than Hannah and Garrett. That is useful. But there is a fine line between planting seeds and leaving characters slightly underdeveloped in the present. Sometimes a side character enters with energy, style, or emotional suggestion, and you can almost feel the show saving their depth for later. That can be exciting if you are already invested in the broader universe, but for a viewer focused on this season alone, it can create a small frustration. You want a supporting circle to feel alive now, not only important later. A friend group should not just signal future stories, it should shape the emotional reality of the current one. And while off campus often gets the social energy right, a few characters could have used sharper individual definition inside this specific chapter. The fourth issue is tonal balance. The film wants to be romantic, dramatic, funny, emotionally serious, socially alive, and sometimes deeply vulnerable. That is a difficult mix. The best scenes blend those tones naturally. A joke protects someone from saying the truth. A flirtatious moment suddenly reveals fear. A social scene carries loneliness underneath it. That is when the tone feels layered. But there are moments where the transition between lightness and heaviness feels slightly too clean. A painful subject can arrive, land, and then the story moves back toward romantic momentum a little too quickly. Or a playful scene can come close to undercutting a darker emotional shadow before that shadow has fully settled. This does not destroy the film, but it does soften some of its power. A story with this kind of emotional material needs the courage to sit in discomfort when discomfort is necessary. The fifth weakness is that Garrett's charm can sometimes be too effective for the story's own good. This is not a criticism of the character being charming. He has to be. That is part of the fantasy and part of the social structure. But if the story lets charm solve too much too quickly, it risks making emotional repair feel easier than it should. Garrett is strongest when he has to earn trust through patience, restraint, and accountability. He is less interesting when the show relies too heavily on the idea that his warmth can smooth over conflict. Because Hannah's trust should not feel simple, it should feel earned. And the film is best when it understands that. The strongest version of their romance is not Garrett breaking through Hannah's walls with persistence. It is Garrett learning when not to push. It is him realizing that love is not about winning access to someone. It is about becoming safe enough that access can be offered freely. When the story remembers that, it works beautifully. When it forgets, even briefly, the romance becomes more conventional. Finally, off campus sometimes stops just short of its deepest ideas. It gestures toward questions about identity, recovery, masculinity pressure, desire, and the way young people perform adulthood before they understand themselves. Those ideas are all present, but not all of them are explored with equal sharpness. Some remain in the background, supporting the romance without fully becoming part of the conversation. That is the biggest missed opportunity, because this story has the material to be more than emotionally engaging. It has the material to be truly piercing. It could dig even deeper into how campus culture rewards performance, how athletes are trained to hide weakness, how young women are expected to be strong and healed before they are ready, and how romantic love can help but cannot replace personal recovery. The film reaches toward those ideas. It just does not always hold them long enough. Still, these flaws do not erase what works. They mostly show where off campus could have been stronger, sharper, and more emotionally daring. The foundation is there, the chemistry is there, the world is there, the themes are there, but the box has corners it does not fully open. And that is why the film feels good, sometimes very good, but not always as unforgettable as it clearly has the potential to be. The easiest comparison for off campus is not one single film. It sits at the crossing point between college romance, sports drama, new adult adaptation, and emotional recovery story. That combination gives it a very specific flavor. It is not as light as a pure romantic comedy. It is not as dark as a psychological drama. It is not only about desire, and it is not only about trauma. It is trying to live in the messy middle, where attraction, ambition, fear, and healing keep pulling against each other. So the first comparison has to be after. Not because the stories are identical, but because both live in that world of intense young romance, built from best-selling page to screen material. Both understand the fantasy of a connection that feels overwhelming, almost unavoidable, like two people are being pulled into something larger than logic, but whereafter often leans into volatility as the engine of passion. Off campus is more interesting when it leans into emotional safety as the real destination. That is a major difference. After Ask You to Feel the Storm, Off campus works best when it asks you to notice what happens after someone has lived too long inside storms and starts craving calm without knowing how to trust it. Garrett and Hannah's dynamic has heat, yes, but the better parts are not only about tension, they are about restraint, listening, boundaries. The slow discovery that intimacy is not supposed to feel like a constant emergency. That gives off campus a softer, more grounded emotional center. But by comparison, After has a sharper sense of chaos. It knows how to turn romantic instability into a spectacle. Off campus is less explosive, and for some viewers, that may make it feel less instantly addictive. It trades some melodramatic intensity for emotional patience. Whether that works depends on what you want. If you want romance that feels like a wildfire, After may hit harder. If you want romance that asks whether love can become a safe place instead of a dangerous one, Off Campus has the better emotional question. The second comparison is The Summer I Turned Pretty. Again, the surface is different. That story is built around summers, family history, first love, nostalgia, and the painful triangle between longing and timing. Off campus is more adult in setting, more directly tied to college independence, sports culture, and personal recovery. But both stories understand that young love is never only about the person in front of you. It is about who you are becoming while you love them. That is the shared heartbeat. The Summer I Turned Pretty often feels like memory. It has that sunlit ache, that feeling of looking back at a season when everything felt permanent because you did not yet understand how quickly life changes. Off campus feels less nostalgic and more immediate. It is not looking back at youth through warm light. It is standing inside youth while the pressure is still happening. That makes off campus feel more restless. Where the Summer I Turned Pretty is about the emotional weight of history, off campus is about the emotional risk of reinvention. Hannah and Garrett are not trapped mainly by childhood patterns between families. They are trapped by the identities they are currently performing. She is trying to define herself beyond pain. He is trying to define himself beyond status. Their romance matters because it interrupts the version of themselves they thought they had to be. That is where off campus does something strong. It makes romance feel like a challenge to identity. The third comparison is Normal People. Now, Normal People is more restrained, more intimate, more emotionally severe in its quietness. It has a different artistic language. But it is worth bringing into the comparison because both stories are deeply interested in how two people can be drawn to each other and still struggle to meet cleanly because of class, insecurity, trauma, pride, and timing. Normal People is better at silence. It understands awkwardness, emotional self sabotage, and the pain of people who know each other deeply but still fail to communicate at crucial moments. Off campus is more genre forward. It uses familiar romance architecture more openly. The fake arrangement, the athlete status, the campus circle, the slow burn structure. Those pieces make it more accessible and more conventionally satisfying. But Normal People is the sharper emotional blade. Off campus does not always cut that deep. It could, but it often chooses warmth and momentum over total emotional exposure. That is not automatically a flaw. It simply means the viewing experience is different. Normal People leaves you sitting in ache. Off campus wants to hurt, heal, charm, and entertain at the same time. The fourth comparison is the kissing booth, but mostly as a contrast. The kissing booth represents the lighter, brighter, more fantasy driven side of young romance. It is built around wish fulfillment, friendship drama, first love, and exaggerated emotional stakes. Off campus shares some of the accessible romantic appeal, but it is aiming for something more mature. Its characters are older. The emotional material is heavier. The romance is more tied to personal boundaries, agency, ambition, and recovery. That is where off campus clearly has more depth. But the kissing booth has simplicity on its side. It knows exactly what kind of candy it is. Off campus is trying to be a fuller meal. That makes it more rewarding when it works, but also more vulnerable when it does not. A light romance can survive thin psychology because it is moving on charm. A story like Off Campus needs emotional truth to land. because it asks you to care about serious wounds and real growth. So, what does Off Campus do that others in its genre do not? It combines sport status fantasy with emotional safety in a way that gives the central romance a more thoughtful shape. Gad is not interesting only because he is desirable. He is interesting because the story asks whether someone used to being admired can learn to be trustworthy. Hannah is not interesting only because she is guarded. She is interesting because the story gives her a life beyond being protected by someone else. Their relationship works best when it is not about rescue, but recognition. Where does it fall short by comparison? It does not always have the poetic emotional precision of normal people. It does not always have the addictive chaos of After. It does not always have the nostalgic softness of The Summer I Turned Pretty. And it does not always have the effortless simplicity of lighter teen romances. Off Campus is trying to hold many tones at once, and sometimes you can feel the effort. But when it finds its lane, that lane is strong. If you loved Off Campus, watch The Summer I Turned Pretty next for romantic longing and young emotional confusion. Watch Normal People if you want a quieter, more painful study of intimacy and miscommunication. Watch After if you want the more chaotic, heightened version of page to screen romantic obsession. And watch The Kissing Booth only if what you want is something lighter, faster, and less emotionally demanding. But if Off Campus did not work for you and the familiar romance structure felt too predictable, go straight to Normal People. That is the sharper alternative. If the emotional heaviness felt too much, go lighter with a campus or teen romance that does not ask for the same level of vulnerability. If the sports world was what grabbed you most, look for stories where athletic identity and pressure are central, because that is one of the strongest ingredients here. Off Campus may not be the deepest version of this kind of story, but it understands something many romances forget. The fantasy is not just being loved by the person everyone wants. The fantasy is being loved by someone who sees the hardest part of you and does not turn that knowledge into power. Off Campus arrived at a very specific moment, not just in streaming but in romance culture. By the time this story reached Prime Video in May 2026, the world around romance adaptations had changed. These were no longer quiet projects made only for people who already read the books. They had become full cultural events, shaped by book talk, fan casting, teaser reactions, shipping culture, hockey romance obsession, and the streaming industry's hunger for stories that could turn one season into an entire emotional universe. Off Campus premiered globally on May 13, 2026, with all 8 episodes arriving at once in more than 240 countries and territories, which immediately positioned it as a binge-first, conversation-ready romance event rather than a slow weekly discovery. That matters because this kind of release changes the way people experience a love story. When a romance drops all at once, the audience does not just watch the relationship grow. They consume the emotional arc almost like a novel. One episode becomes the next chapter. One cliffhanger becomes the next page turn. One almost confession becomes the reason you stay awake longer than you planned. That binge structure fits Off Campus especially well because the source material already comes from a reading culture where people devour emotional tension quickly and then immediately want to talk about it. And that is exactly the world the show entered. It arrived into a culture where romance fans are not passive. They analyze casting, they compare book scenes to screen scenes, they debate chemistry, they notice change details, they defend characters, they criticize adaptation choices. They build edits, clips, reactions, and theory threads within hours. For a story like Off Campus, that is not background noise, that is part of the life of the series, the show was not only watched, it was processed socially. That is why the reception became so interesting. Critically, Off Campus landed stronger than many people might have expected from a college romance adaptation. Rotten Tomatoes listed season 1 with a 91% score, while IMDb described the series as a college-set romantic drama about a music student and a star hockey player, with themes of love, adulthood, friendship, and enduring bonds. But the bigger story was audience momentum. Prime Video said Off Campus reached 36 million viewers worldwide in its first 12 days, making it one of the platform's biggest debut series launches. That is not a small number. That is the kind of number that tells you this was not only a niche romance adaptation quietly serving existing fans, it crossed into mainstream streaming visibility. People who had never read the deal were suddenly entering Briar University, meeting Hannah and Garrett, and discovering why this world already had such intense loyalty behind it. Here is where it gets layered. Critics and audiences often split when it comes to romance. Critics sometimes dismiss familiar tropes too quickly, while fans sometimes defend emotional satisfaction even when the structure is predictable. Off Campus sits in the middle of that tension. It is absolutely built on recognizable romance architecture, but the reason it connected is that many people were not watching only for surprise. They were watching for emotional delivery. They wanted the deal. They wanted the tension. They wanted the fake arrangement becoming real. They wanted Garrett's confidence to soften. They wanted Hannah's guardedness to be respected, not punished. They wanted the fantasy, but they also wanted the fantasy handled with care. That is where the show's cultural value becomes clearer. It arrived in a moment where younger audiences, especially romance audiences, are more vocal about emotional safety, consent, communication, and the difference between passion and toxicity. One recent reflection on the series specifically placed how a campus presents healthier relationship dynamics, including respect, communication, consent, and emotionally intelligent male behavior. That is important because older romance culture often romanticizes chaos as proof of depth. If two people hurt each other enough, the story framed it as intensity. If someone crossed boundaries, the story framed it as desire. If jealousy became control, the story called it passion. Off Campus still uses fantasy. It still uses heightened romance. But at its strongest, it pushes toward a different emotional model. It suggests that the real fantasy is not being overwhelmed by someone. The real fantasy is being respected by someone who could have power over you but chooses care instead. That is why Garrett matters culturally as much as romantically. He belongs to the familiar world of the star athlete love interest, but the show is most effective when it updates that fantasy. His appeal is not only status, not only looks, not only confidence. His appeal becomes patience, attention, and the ability to learn that love is not access. Love is responsibility. And Hannah matters because she reflects a shift in how audiences want wounded heroines to be written. She is not there simply to be fixed. She is not a sad backstory waiting for a romantic rescue. The best version of her story gives her agency, desire, humor, ambition, and boundaries. That is why the show feels more modern than some older versions of the same genre. It understands that healing should not erase personality. Awards are a different conversation. As of late June 2006, Off Campus is still too new to have a full awards legacy. And honestly, this may not be the kind of series built first for traditional prestige recognition. Its impact is more immediate, more audience driven, more streaming cultural. If it deserves recognition, that recognition should probably begin with casting chemistry, adaptation strategy, and the way it translates a book-centered emotional experience into a bingeable screen romance. What was overlooked? The craft of making familiar tropes feel emotionally safe without draining them of tension. That is harder than it looks. It is easy to make romance toxic and call it intense. It is easy to make romance soft and accidentally make it boring. The harder move is to keep the heat, keep the fantasy, keep the friction, but still move the relationship toward respect. Off Campus does not do that perfectly every time, but when it does, it feels very connected to the cultural moment it arrived in, and then there is the franchise context. Prime Video had already confirmed Season 2, with Teen Vogue reporting that the next season would shift focus toward Dean and Ali. That makes Off Campus feel less like a one-off romance and more like an interconnected relationship universe, closer in structure to the way modern streaming audiences follow rotating couple stories. That also shapes how the first season is remembered. Hannah and Garrett are not only a couple, they are the opening argument for the entire world. If their story works, the audience trusts the box enough to open the next one. If their chemistry lands, Dean and Allie inherit momentum. If the Briar universe feels alive, then every side character becomes a future promise. So does off-campus feel timeless or perfectly of its era? The answer is both, but not equally. The emotional core is timeless, wanting to be seen, feeling vulnerability, mistaking control for safety, discovering that love can become a mirror. Those ideas will always matter, but the packaging is very 2026. The binge drop, the book talk energy, the hockey romance wave, the streaming franchise design, the immediate social media reaction cycle, the expectation that romance should be both passionate and emotionally responsible. That is the world off campus arrived into, and that is why its success makes sense. It gave audiences a familiar fantasy at the exact moment they were asking for that fantasy to grow up. The fan theory conversation around off campus is interesting because this is not the kind of story where people are merely debating monsters, timelines, secret identities, or hidden villains. They are debating emotional intention. That is what makes the theories feel different. Fans are not only asking what happened, they are asking what a look meant, what a change scene means for the next season, whether a side character's early presence is just set up, or whether the show is quietly rewriting the emotional map of the books. And because Off Campus comes from a beloved book series, every small adaptation choice becomes a clue. The first major theory is that the show is not simply adapting one book per season in a clean lock pattern. It is building a more blended Briar universe, where future romances begin earlier than expected. This theory gained weight because Dean and Ali's dynamic was pushed forward in season 1, even though book readers know their full story belongs later in the off campus sequence. Entertainment Weekly reported that season 2 is officially shifting focus to Dean and Ali, while Hannah and Garrett remain part of the ensemble, which supports the idea that the show is treating the world as interconnected rather than completely segmented. This theory holds up because on screen, a series cannot always work exactly like a book series. In a novel, you can meet side characters and wait hundreds of pages, or even another book, before they become central. In a show, if you introduce compelling characters and then keep them frozen in the background, the world can feel artificial. So, off campus starts letting future stories breathe early. That does not mean it is abandoning the books. It means it is adapting the experience of living in Briar, where everyone's emotional life is happening at the same time. The second fan theory is that Dean and Ali's early storyline was not just set up for season 2, but a deliberate test to see whether the audience would accept a more remix style adaptation. That one also feels believable. The New York Post reported that showrunner Louisa Levy described the Dean and Ali change as organic, especially because Ali is close to Hannah, and also noted that their future story could still continue with changes from the novels. That matters because it tells us the show is not afraid to move pieces around. And that creates a big question for fans. If Dean and Ali can begin earlier, what else can shift? Could Logan and Grace be introduced differently? Could later emotional arcs overlap with earlier ones? Could some book conflicts be softened, expanded, or redirected to fit a streaming ensemble format? That is where the theory becomes exciting but also risky. It holds up as an adaptation strategy, but it can fall apart if the show moves too fast. Romance needs build up. If every future couple is teased too aggressively, the world starts feeling like a checklist instead of a living environment. The best version of this approach is subtle. You let chemistry appear before plot. You let glances create curiosity. You let the audience feel a future without forcing it too early. The third theory is about Hannah and Garrett's ending. Some fans read their story not as a closed romantic arc, but as the emotional foundation for how the show will define healthy love going forward. That theory feels strong because season 1 positions their relationship around trust, consent, patience, and the difference between being wanted and being safe. Recent commentary around the show has specifically highlighted how Off Campus presents healthier relationship dynamics and emotionally respectful romance compared with more chaotic older romance models. This theory holds up emotionally. Hannah and Garrett are the first box because their story teaches the rules of the show's heart. It tells us this universe may still have drama, jealousy, longing, mistakes, and messy decisions, but the destination is not destruction. The destination is recognition. The fantasy is not someone taking over your life. The fantasy is someone learning how to treat your vulnerability with care. That becomes important for every future couple. Because once season 1 establishes that emotional standard, season 2 cannot simply become chaos for chaos's sake. Dean and Allie can be messier, louder, more impulsive, and more complicated, but the show still has to ask the same deeper question. Can these people become better at love because they are brave enough to become more honest? The fourth fan theory is that Garrett's public identity as the perfect athlete is more fragile than the show first lets on, and that his arc is really a critique of performance culture. This one is less about future plot and more about interpretation. It suggests that Garrett is not simply the dream guy, he is a character trapped inside being the dream guy. Everyone sees the captain, the star, the confident center of the room. Hannah sees the exhaustion underneath. That theory absolutely holds up because off campus repeatedly contrasts public performance with private truth. Garrett on the ice is controlled motion. Garrett with Hannah is emotional uncertainty. That difference is not accidental. The show seems to be asking what happens when someone who has been rewarded for confidence has to learn humility, patience, and emotional accountability. The fifth theory is that the title off campus is symbolic, not just literal. This may be the simplest theory, but it is also one of the strongest. Off campus is not only where the characters live or where certain scenes happen. It means outside the official system, outside supervision, outside the clean identity everyone performs in public. It is where the characters become harder to manage, harder to label, and more honest in their plan. That theory holds up completely. The official campus world gives everyone roles: student, athlete, singer, friend, teammate, crush, roommate. But off campus, those roles blur. People become private, secrets gain weight, desire becomes harder to hide, and the story starts asking who these characters are when nobody is grading them, coaching them, applauding them, or protecting them from consequences. The theories that do not hold up are the ones that treat every change from the books as betrayal. That is too simple. Adaptation is not photocopying, it is translation. Some changes weaken a story, yes, but some changes are necessary because television has a different rhythm. The real question is not whether the show changes details. The real question is whether those changes protect the emotional truth. And with off campus, that is what fans are really debating, not just what happened. What mattered beneath the romance, beneath the dating, beneath the campus energy and the hockey pressure and the slow burn tension off campus is really about one simple but painful question. What happens when the version of yourself that helped you survive starts preventing you from living? That is the deeper layer. Because Hannah and Garrett are not only two people falling for each other. They are two people who built identities out of protection. Hannah learned how to protect herself by controlling access. Gary learned how to protect himself by controlling perception. One hides by becoming selective, the other hides by becoming impressive. And the tragedy is that both strategies work until love enters the room. That is what the film understands. Sometimes the things that save us in one chapter become the things that trap us in the next. Hannah's guardedness makes sense. It is not random. It is not a personality flaw thrown in to create romantic tension. It is a language of survival. When someone has been hurt, especially in a way that changes their relationship with trust, the world stops feeling simple. A harmless touch may not feel harmless. A compliment may not feel safe. A room may not feel neutral. A person's kindness may come with a question mark attached to it. So Hannah watches, she measures, she decides what to reveal and what to keep protected. And the film is strongest when it respects that, because her deeper journey is not about becoming easier for someone else to love. That would be too small. Her journey is about reclaiming the right to choose closeness without fear deciding everything for her. That is different. That gives her agency. The point is not that Garrett breaks down her walls. The point is that Hannah slowly realizes she is allowed to open a door from the inside. That is a much more human idea. Garrett's deeper layer is different but connected. He is surrounded by attention, yet attention does not equal intimacy. He is admired, but admiration can become another kind of loneliness. When everyone thinks they know you because they know your role, your talent, your reputation, or your public image, it becomes harder to admit that you are not okay. That is Garrett's trap. He has become good at being the version of himself other people reward: the athlete, the leader, the charming guy, the one who can handle pressure, the one who can smile through tension, the one who seems confident enough that nobody thinks to ask what confidence is hiding. And this is where off campus becomes more than romance. It becomes a story about performance culture. Everyone is performing something. Hannah performs control. Garrett performs ease. Friends perform confidence. Students perform adulthood. The campus itself becomes a stage where young people act like finished versions of themselves, even though most of them are still being built in real time. That is why the setting matters so much. College is one of the first places where many people get to rewrite themselves. But rewriting yourself can be dangerous when you do not know the difference between growth and disguise. You can call yourself independent while secretly feeling abandoned. You can call yourself confident while secretly feeling terrified. You can call something casual because admitting it matters would give it power over you. Off campus lives inside that contradiction. It understands that young adulthood is not only freedom, it is exposure. Suddenly, you are away from the old rules, but you have not fully built new ones. You are old enough to choose, but not always wise enough to understand what your choices are really asking of you. You can enter rooms your younger self dreamed about only to realize that the hardest thing is not getting there. The hardest thing is knowing who you are once you arrive. That is why the romance between Hannah and Garrett works symbolically. It is not just about attraction between opposites, it is about two different survival systems colliding. Hannah's system says, stay careful, stay controlled, do not let anyone too close unless you know exactly what they want. Garrett's system says, stay charming, stay useful, keep moving, keep winning, never let them see the uncertainty. But love interrupts both systems. Love asks Hannah to consider that vulnerability does not always mean danger. Love asks Garrett to understand that being wanted is not the same as being trusted. And the film's deeper emotional argument is that real intimacy begins only when performance fails, not when the characters look perfect, not when they say the right thing, not when the romantic fantasy is at its highest, but when they are finally seen in the part of themselves they did not know how to present. That is why the small moments matter more than the big ones. A quiet conversation, a pause where someone chooses not to run, a moment where Garrett listens instead of trying to win, a moment where Hannah lets herself want something without punishing herself for wanting it. These are the moments where the deeper story lives. The symbols are simple but effective. The ring is a symbol of public identity. It is where Garrett becomes measurable, wins, losses, skills, speed, discipline, reputation. Everything can be seen. Everything can be judged. On the ice, he knows the rules. He knows what success looks like. He knows how to move. But intimacy has no scoreboard. That is why Hannah becomes such a meaningful challenge for him. With her, he cannot simply perform well and receive approval. He has to become emotionally careful. He has to understand that trust is not something you earn through confidence. It is something you earn through consistency. Music works as Hannah's symbol. Music is voice without ordinary conversation. It is expression that does not have to explain itself in plain language. For someone like Hannah, music becomes a place where feeling can exist without being interrogated. It gives shape to things that are hard to say. It lets her be visible without being reduced. That matters because her deeper fear is not simply being seen. It is being seen incorrectly. She does not want her pain to become the whole story. She does not want desire to feel like surrender. She does not want love to mean losing authorship over herself. So music becomes proof that Hannah has a voice before romance gives her one. Garrett does not create her voice. He learns how to hear it That distinction is everything. The off campus spaces are another recurring symbol. They represent the private self, the messy self, the self outside the official version. On campus, everyone has a label. Off campus, labels become less useful. That is where people reveal what they actually want, what they fear, what they hide, and what they are willing to risk. But the film does not pretend privacy is automatically safe. Private spaces can heal, but they can also expose. They can create honesty, but they can also create secrecy. That double meaning is what makes the title strong. Off campus is freedom, yes, but freedom without self understanding can become chaos. The space outside rules only become safe when the people inside it learn responsibility. And that is the real emotional lesson. Love is not the opposite of fear. Love is what asks you to stop letting fear make every decision. Off campus connects because that feeling is not limited to college. Everyone eventually reaches a point where an old defense mechanism stops working. Maybe you avoid conflict because it once kept you safe. Maybe you overachieve because praise became your protection. Maybe you joke through pain. Maybe you stay distant. Maybe you chase people who cannot really see you because being truly seen would require more courage. That is why the film's deeper layer feels relatable. It is not asking whether Hannah and Garrett are perfect together. It is asking whether two imperfect people can become honest enough to stop turning survival into identity. And that is the heart of it. Off campus is about love, but not just the kind that makes your heart race. It is about the kind of love that quietly asks, who taught you to hide like this? And are you ready, even slowly, to come back to yourself? The legacy of off campus is still being written. That is the honest place to begin. Because some films arrive with decades of influence already behind them. You can look at the movies they changed, the trends they started, the careers they reshaped, the language they gave to a genre. Off campus is different. It is too new for that kind of long historical judgment. Its legacy is not carved into cinema yet. It is still moving through conversations, reactions, fan edits, streaming numbers, book community debates, and the way audiences talk about romance in this exact cultural moment. But even this early, you can see what it represents. Off campus is part of a bigger shift in screen romance. It belongs to an era where book adaptations are not just adaptations, they are events. They arrive with fandoms already waiting. They arrive with expectations before the first scene plays. They arrive with people who have imagined the characters for years, argued about casting, saved favorite passages, and built emotional ownership over fictional relationships. That changes everything. Because when a story like this moves from page to screen, it is not only trying to entertain, it is trying to survive comparison with a private movie that already existed inside every reader's head. That is an almost impossible task. No actor can look exactly like every reader imagined. No scene can carry exactly the same rhythm as the book did in someone's mind. No adaptation can bring every internal thought to the screen without changing form. So, the legacy of off campus may begin with translation. How do you translate a romance that readers experienced internally into a visual story that has to work externally? How do you turn thoughts into looks? How do you turn emotional narration into silence? How do you turn a beloved trope into something that feels alive for people who already know where it is going? That is where its influence could matter. Not because off campus invented college romance, it did not. Not because it invented the athlete love interest, it did not. Not because it invented fake dating, emotional healing, guarded heroines, or messy young adulthood. These ingredients have existed for a long time, but off campus arrives at a moment when those ingredients are being re examined. Older romance often treated intensity as the highest form of love. The more chaotic, the more passionate, the more possessive, the more romantic. The more emotionally unavailable, the more desirable. Off campus steps into that tradition, but the better version of it pushes towards something different. It asks whether the fantasy can still feel exciting without making emotional danger the main proof of love. That is where the show feels connected to the future of the genre. The next wave of romance does not have to remove tension. It does not have to make every love interest perfect, gentle, and conflict free. That would be lifeless. Romance needs friction. It needs uncertainty. It needs characters who misunderstand each other, challenge each other, and bring old wounds into new connections. But the genre is evolving in how it frames those wounds. Off campus works best when it says chemistry is not enough. Care matters. Consent matters. Patience matters. Emotional accountability matters. And that shift may become part of its lasting identity. If the series continues, its real influence will not come from one couple alone. It will come from the world it builds around multiple relationships. That is the power of the Briar structure. Hannah and Garrett open the first box, but they are not the only story inside the room. Each future romance has the chance to explore a different emotional question, different wounds, different fears, different forms of intimacy, different ways people confuse love with control, safety with distance, desire with certainty, or performance with identity. That interconnected design gives off campus room to grow beyond a single love story, and that is important for its legacy. A standalone romance can be remembered for chemistry. A continuing romance universe can be remembered for emotional architecture. If each couple adds a new layer to the larger conversation, then Off Campus becomes more than a hit adaptation. It becomes a map of young adulthood, told through different kinds of love. That is the strongest possible future for it. But there is also a risk. The more a franchise expands, the more easily it can become formula. One couple after another, one trope after another, one emotional wound, one romantic cure, one conflict, one resolution. If the show falls into that, its influence will shrink. It will become comforting, maybe popular, but not truly lasting. The challenge is to let each story feel specific. Each relationship must have its own rhythm, its own emotional problem, its own reason to exist. That is what separates a universe from a pattern. Off campus has the ingredients for a universe. The hockey culture gives it a shared pressure system. The campus gives it a social stage. The off campus spaces give it privacy and risk. The friend group gives it continuity. The romance structure gives it momentum. And the characters, if developed fully, can give it depth beyond fantasy. That is where the show could influence future adaptations. It could remind studios that romance audiences do not only want pretty scenes and familiar tropes, they want emotional payoff. They want the beloved moments, yes, but they also want the emotional logic behind them. They want chemistry that feels earned. They want characters who are flawed without being careless inventions. They want drama, but not empty drama. They want a fantasy that still respects the reality of what people carry. That is a harder standard, and it is a good one. For film and television history, Off Campus may not become the kind of title that transforms the entire industry overnight. That would be too big a claim. But it may become one of those projects that marks a specific wave, the streaming era rise of new adult romance as a serious audience force. Stories once dismissed as guilty pleasures are becoming central entertainment. Fan communities are shaping what gets adapted. Book culture is shaping streaming culture. Romance is no longer sitting quietly at the side of the room. It is driving numbers. It is driving conversation. It is building franchises. And Off Campus is part of that movement. Its reputation will depend on what comes next. If future seasons deepen the world, respect the characters, and avoid turning emotional complexity into formula, the series could grow stronger over time. If it becomes too polished, too predictable, or too dependent on fan service, it may remain a successful moment rather than a lasting one. Right now, its legacy is possibility. A promise that college romance can be glassy without being empty, familiar without being lazy, emotional without being careless, romantic without confusing love with control. And maybe that is the influence Off Campus wants to leave behind. Not that every love story needs to be perfect, but that every love story should understand the difference between being desired and being truly seen. Alright, full spoilers from this point. If you haven't seen the film yet, close this now. Go watch it and come back when you're ready. Trust me, you'll want to experience it fresh. The first major twist in Off Campus is that the deal is never really about the deal. On paper, Hannah helps Garrett with class, and Garrett helps Hannah get the attention of Justin through a fake dating arrangement. But the real turn happens when that fake relationship becomes the safest emotional space either of them has. What begins as strategy slowly turns into recognition. Hannah is not just using Garrett to become visible to someone else. Garrett is not just using Hannah to protect his hockey future. They are both, without admitting it, testing whether pureness can exist without danger. That is why the fake dating setup matters so much. It gives both characters emotional cover. They can stand close and pretend it means nothing. They can spend time together and call it practical. They can look at each other too long and hide behind the rules of the arrangement. But the audience knows the truth before they do. The performance is becoming real because it allows them to be honest in ways real dating would have made too frightening. Then comes the deeper reveal about Hannah. Hannah's guardedness is not a romantic quirk. It is not there just to make Garrett work harder. She is a survivor of sexual assault from her high school past, and that history shapes how she moves through intimacy, trust, desire, and public spaces. The show's strongest choice is that it does not turn her trauma into a cheap twist. It treats it as something that has quietly shaped her relationship with her own body and her own voice long before Garrett entered the story. This is the point where the box opens in a more painful way. Suddenly, the earlier details hit differently. Hannah's caution around parties, her need for control, her difficulty with certain kinds of closeness, her struggle to write lyrics, her instinct to keep painful truths contained. These are not random character traits, they are survival patterns. And when she finally lets Garrett know the truth, the scene matters. Because it is not about him becoming the hero, it is about her choosing to speak. Garrett's reaction is important, but it is also dangerous. He wants to protect her. He wants to erase what happened. He wants the world to pay for the pain she has carried. That instinct is emotionally understandable, but the show is smart enough to show that protection can become complicated when it turns into violence. Garrett is not only responding to Hannah's trauma, he is also being forced to face his own fear that the anger inside him may be connected to the father he never wanted to become. And that leads to one of the biggest turns in the finale. During the hockey game against Briar's rival, Garrett realizes that one of the opposing players is the person who assaulted Hannah in high school. He loses control and attacks him on the ice. The moment is shocking because it combines every part of Garrett's arc: love, rage, hockey, masculinity, public performance, and inherited fear. He thinks he is defending Hannah, but the aftermath forces him to confront something much darker inside himself. This is where the film becomes more than a romance. Because Garrett's violence does not heal Hannah. It does not undo the past. It does not magically prove love. Instead, it reveals how easily pain can travel from one person to another when it is not handled carefully. Hannah's wound becomes Garrett's rage. Garrett's rage becomes a crisis, and the relationship has to ask whether love can survive when one person's attempt to protect becomes another reminder that control can be taken away. That is why Garrett's fear of becoming like his father matters. His father's shadow hangs over him as a warning. Garrett has always wanted to be different, better, safer, more emotionally awake. But in that game, he sees how quickly anger can become action. He sees how frightening it is to carry a family pattern inside yourself, even when you hate it. His breakdown is not only about what he did, it is about what he thinks it says about who he might be. The breakup becomes the emotional fallout from that fear. In the book version, Hannah's breakup with Garrett is tied to pressure from his father, but in the show, Garrett is the one who ends things. And showrunner Louisa Levy has explained that this change was designed to still honor Garrett's character while reshaping the emotional logic for television. That change matters, because if Garrett walks away, he is not walking away because he stopped loving Hannah. He is walking away because he thinks love might not be enough to make him safe. He believes distance may protect her from him. It is painful because the same man who learned to respect Hannah's boundaries suddenly creates distance without fully trusting her to make her own choice. His fear becomes another form of control, even if it comes from a wounded place. Hannah's side of the ending is just as important. Her performance is not only a musical moment, it is symbolic recovery. Throughout the season, writing and singing are tied to her voice, her identity, and the part of herself trauma tried to silence. When she finally performs a song she wrote herself, the scene is not simply about talent, it is about authorship. Hannah is no longer letting the worst thing that happened to her define the edge of what she can express. That is the hidden meaning of the performance. Garrett matters, but he's not the whole point. The point is that Hannah finds a way back to herself. Music becomes the proof that her story still belongs to her. She can desire, she can create, she can choose, she can be seen without being reduced to pain. That is why the scene lands emotionally even before the romance resolves. When Hannah and Garrett reconnect after the performance, the ending does not feel like a simple romantic reward. It feels like two people choosing each other with a clearer understanding of what love can and cannot do. Garrett cannot rewrite Hannah's past. Hannah cannot remove Garrett's fear with one conversation, but they can choose honesty. They can choose accountability. They can choose not to let trauma, rage, or inherited damage make the final decision for them. So, yes, Hannah and Garrett end the season together. But the real ending is not they got back together. The real ending is that both characters stop treating love like performance. Hannah does not have to pretend she is untouched by pain. Garrett does not have to pretend confidence means control. They return to each other more exposed than before, and that is why the reconciliation feels earned. Then the show opens another box. Dean and Alice's storyline becomes the season's major sequel hook. Their connection starts earlier than book readers may have expected, and by the end it is emotionally messy, unresolved, and clearly positioned to carry the next wave of drama. Dean develops real feelings. Ali tries to protect herself from being trapped in something too serious too quickly, and then the finale throws gasoline on everything with the Carter reveal. The reveal is that Carter is actually Hunter Davenport, someone tied to Dean's rivalry and future conflict. That twist changes the entire meaning of Ali's choice. What looked like a messy but private attempt to create distance from Dean becomes a direct setup for season two's emotional damage. It is not just a hookup twist, it is a triangle of insecurity, timing, pride, and rivalry waiting to explode. That final reveal functions like the show's real post credit energy. It tells us Hannah and Garrett's box has closed for now, but Briar is not done hurting, healing, and complicating its characters. The next story will not begin from peace. It will begin from miscommunication, wounded pride, and the terrible timing of young people trying to protect themselves in ways that hurt someone else. The hidden details were there all along. Gary's hockey life foreshadows his emotional crisis because the rink is the place where control, aggression, discipline, and public judgment collide. Hannah's music foreshadows her recovery because her voice becomes stronger as her self trust returns. The fake dating foreshadows the entire structure of the season because everyone is pretending something, pretending not to care, pretending not to hurt, pretending not to need anyone, pretending the rules are still clear. And the title Off Campus becomes the final symbol. This story is not just about what happens away from school. It is about what happens away from supervision, away from reputation, away from the official self. Off campus is where masks slip. It is where desire becomes honest. It is where trauma returns. It is where love stops being fantasy and becomes responsibility. That is what the ending means. Hannah and Garrett do not win because everything is fixed. They win because they finally stop pretending healing has to happen alone. So, where does Off Campus finally land? For me, this is a 5.3 out of 10. And that rating may sound a little harsh at first because there are parts of this story that absolutely work. The chemistry has a pulse. The central idea is strong. Hannah and Garrett have the kind of contrast that makes romance naturally watchable. The college world has energy. The hockey backdrop gives the story pressure. The music gives Hannah an identity beyond the relationship. And when the film slows down enough to let emotional safety become the real fantasy, it finds something genuinely meaningful. But the reason it does not climb higher is because potential and execution are not the same thing. Off Campus has the ingredients for a much sharper, deeper, more unforgettable romance. It has trauma, desire, public identity, private fear, sports culture, music, young adulthood, and a relationship built on the dangerous line between performance and truth. That is powerful material. But too often, the film touches those ideas instead of fully opening them. It gestures toward depth, then steps back into familiar genre comfort before the emotional cut goes deep enough. And that is the frustration, because this is not a story with nothing to say. It has plenty to say. It understands that love is not just attraction. It understands that trust is not automatic. It understands that healing cannot be handed to someone like a romantic gift. It understands that young people often confuse control with safety because control feels easier than vulnerability. But understanding an idea is one thing. Dramatizing it with full force is another. The best scenes in Off Campus prove what the film could have been all the way through. When Hannah and Garrett are allowed to sit inside silence, when the camera lets discomfort breathe, when Garrett stops trying to charm his way through a moment and actually listens, when Hannah becomes more than her wound and more than his love interest, the story works. It becomes intimate, it becomes thoughtful, it becomes the kind of romance that does not just ask who ends up with whom, but what kind of person someone becomes when they are finally loved with care. That is the version of Off Campus I wanted more of. But there are also stretches where the film feels too dependent on the audience already loving the trope, the fake arrangement becoming real, the athlete with hidden pain, the guarded girl learning to trust, the friend group waiting for future storylines. These pieces are familiar, and familiarity is not a crime. But the film does not always sharpen them enough to make them feel fully reborn. So who should watch it? If you love college romance, hockey romance, slow burn tension, book adaptations, emotionally guarded heroines, charming athletes, and stories where two people begin with a deal and end up with something much messier, Off Campus is worth watching. You will probably find enough chemistry, enough comfort, and enough emotional payoff to stay inside the world. If you are already a fan of the books, there is also a different pleasure here. Not just watching the plot unfold, but seeing how the adaptation reshapes the emotional universe for screen. Some changes may bother you, some may make sense, some may open interesting doors for future seasons. But the show clearly wants Prior to feel like more than one couple's story, and that ambition gives it momentum. But if you need romance that feels truly original, painfully precise, or emotionally fearless from beginning to end, this may not fully satisfy you. Off Campus has depth, but it does not always dig. It has heat, but not always surprise. It has emotional themes, but not always the courage to sit with them long enough. Would I watch it in cinema, on streaming, or on it? Streaming is the right home. This is a bingeable, emotionally accessible, fan driven romance world. It is the kind of story you watch late at night, episode after episode, because you want to see when the walls finally come down. I would not call it essential ownership, and I would not frame it as a must see cinematic event. But as a streaming romance with enough feeling to justify the conversation, it earns its place. Off Campus is not a masterpiece. It is not empty either. It is a box full of strong ideas, familiar shapes, real emotional promise, and a few corners that deserve to be opened wider. And maybe that is the most honest verdict. It does not completely fail. It does not completely fly. It stands in the middle, asking to be loved for what it is while constantly reminding you of what it could have been. Every film is a box. And we open this one together. And that is our full breakdown of Off Campus. Thank you for staying with me through every layer of this box, from the first quiet tension to the final emotional reveal. This is a kind of story that may look simple from far away, but once you open it, there is a lot more inside: romance, pressure, trauma, identity, performance, healing, and the strange danger of finally being seen by someone who matters. Now I want to hear from you. Did Off Campus work for you as a romance, or did it feel too familiar? Did Hannah and Garrett's story hit emotionally, or did you want the film to go deeper? And most importantly, do you think the next chapter of this world can become stronger than the first one? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this is exactly the kind of story where every viewer brings a different emotional reading. Some people will come for the chemistry. Some will come for the book comparison, some will come for the hockey romance fantasy. And some will come because they recognize that feeling of trying to become a new person while still carrying the old pain with them. If you enjoyed this breakdown, leave a like, subscribe to the Film Box and stay close because we are not just watching films here, we are opening them. We are looking for the hidden meaning, the missed detail, the emotional truth, and the reason a story stays with us after the screen goes dark. And in the next video, we are opening another story that looks simple on the surface but has much more waiting underneath. Every film is a box, and we've only just started opening them. That's the Film Box. See you in the next one.